My grandmother put this chain on me with her last breath. You're gonna have to explain to me which safety policy is more important than that.
Remove that jewelry now. The voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of someone who had never been told no, flat, certain, immovable. The kind of voice that expects the world to rearrange itself on command. But we haven't done anything. I didn't ask what you've done. I told you what to do. Those were our grandmothers. I don't care what those cameras show. This is my aircraft, and you'll comply. A gasp. Somewhere in the rows behind them, a sharp intake of breath from a stranger who couldn't believe what they were hearing. And then her voice again. Not to the boys this time, but directed further back, at someone seated in the row behind them, dripping with contempt. You think wearing those little glasses makes you smart? Silence. The kind of silence that fills a pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet when every single passenger within earshot has just understood, simultaneously, that something has gone very wrong. And then nothing. Just the hum of the engines. And the face of a 9-year-old boy, one hand raised to the small gold chain at his collar, tears sliding silently down his cheeks, his whole body asking a question his mouth couldn't form. Why is this happening to us? That is where we are going today. That is the moment we are going to take apart, piece by piece, until you understand every single thing that led to it, and every single thing that came after. Because what happened on that flight was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. And it was most certainly not the end of the story. My name is Andrew, and if you are new here, this channel exists to tell stories like this one. Stories about dignity. Stories about injustice. Stories about the moments when ordinary people are pushed to their absolute limits and what happens when they refuse completely and quietly to break. If that is the kind of story you came here for, make sure you are subscribed right now because we put out new stories every single week and you do not want to miss what is coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning. 2 hours before that confrontation, before Sandra Merritt ever opened her mouth, before the cabin went silent and the world shifted on its axis, there were 2 little boys buckling their seatbelts for the very first time. Darius had just helped his little brother Jordan with his. He leaned over, clicked the metal tongue into the buckle, and gave it a small tug the way their mother had shown him. Jordan giggled. He had been giggling since they got to the gate, not because anything was particularly funny, but because he was 9 years old, and he was on an airplane, and the flight attendant who boarded them had smiled at him and handed him a small cup of orange juice before they even took off. And that, to Jordan Isaiah Carter, was the greatest thing that had ever happened in his entire life. Darius adjusted the cross at his own collar. Then he reached over and straightened the small gold heart chain at Jordan's. Both chains caught the morning light coming through the oval window, warm and soft in gold, the way old things are gold, worn smooth by years and years of being loved. Jordan pressed his forehead to the glass as the runway began to scroll past beneath them. His breath fogged the plastic. Darius, he said, without turning away from the window. Can Grandma see us from up here? Darius didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said. She can see us. Jordan nodded, satisfied, and watched Atlanta fall away beneath them. We're going to come back to that question. We're going to come back to it at the very end of the story, because it matters more than you know right now. But first, you need to know who these boys are. You need to know where they come from. And most importantly, you need to know who gave them those chains and what those chains cost, and why 2 pieces of gold that weighed almost nothing ended up meaning absolutely everything. Darius Elijah Carter was 11 years old. Jordan Isaiah Carter was 9. They lived with their mother, Diana Carter, in a 3rd-floor apartment in the Vine City neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia. Diana worked doubles at Grady Memorial Hospital. She was a certified nursing assistant, which meant she spent her shifts caring for strangers, holding hands, changing linens, staying calm in moments when calm was the hardest thing to be. She was good at it. She was good at most things that required patience and quiet strength, which is not a coincidence when you understand who raised her. Diana was raised, in large part, by her mother-in-law, Miss Dorothy May Carter. And Miss Dorothy was the sun that the entire Carter family orbited. She lived in Savannah, Georgia, in a house on a corner lot that smelled, from the moment you opened the front door, like sweet potato pie and pine sol, and something underneath both of those things that had no name but felt, to every child who ever walked through that door, like being safe. The kind of safe that is not just the absence of danger but the presence of something, warmth, history, being known. The kind of safe that takes a lifetime to build. Miss Dorothy had built that lifetime deliberately. She had grown up with very little. She had married young, a man named Samuel Carter, quiet and steady and devoted, who worked 31 years at the same plant and never once complained about it. Together they had raised 2 children, buried 1 grandchild, survived 3 hurricanes, and built something in that corner house in Savannah that endured long after Samuel passed. She had worn 2 gold chains every single day for 41 years. A small cross and a tiny gold heart, both of them Samuel's gifts to her. One for their wedding anniversary, one for the day their first child was born. She had not taken them off once in 4 decades. They had worn smooth from being worn, the way things do when they are truly used and truly loved. Darius and Jordan spent part of every summer in that house. Every summer, without exception, from the time they were old enough to be put on a bus to Savannah until the summers when Diana drove them herself. And those summers, those long, slow Savannah summers with the ceiling fans turning lazy and the screen door banging and Miss Dorothy's voice carrying through every room, those summers were the most important thing in their lives. Miss Dorothy taught Darius to read the clouds. Not metaphorically, literally. She would take him out to the back porch in the early morning and point at the sky and name what she saw and tell him what it meant. And within 2 summers, Darius could look at a formation of clouds and tell you with reasonable accuracy what the afternoon was going to bring. She told him it was a skill his grandfather had taught her, and that his grandfather had learned it from his father, and that somewhere in that chain of knowledge was a man who needed to know the weather because his livelihood and his family's survival depended on it. She told Darius, "Never throw away something useful just because you don't need it today." Jordan she taught to cook. He was 5 the first time she let him stir the batter. He was 6 when she let him crack the eggs. By 9, he could make biscuits from scratch, which was something Miss Dorothy considered a life skill on the level of reading, non-negotiable, foundational, something every person should be able to do for themselves and the people they love. She called the 2 brothers her 2 heartbeats. Every single time they walked through her front door, she said it. Not as a greeting, as a fact. As a declaration. You are here. You are mine. The world is better with both of you in it. When Miss Dorothy got sick, and the sickness, when it came slowly and then all at once, the whole family rearranged itself around her care. Diana drove to Savannah on her days off. The boys went with her when school allowed. They sat beside her hospital bed in the room that smelled nothing like her house. Darius read to her. He found a book about weather patterns and read the whole thing aloud over 3 visits, and Miss Dorothy listened with her eyes closed and a small smile on her face, and he couldn't tell if she was sleeping or simply resting, and it didn't matter either way. Jordan drew her portraits. He drew her the way he remembered her, not in the hospital bed, but on the back porch with the ceiling fan turning and a glass of sweet tea in her hand. He taped them to the wall beside her bed until the nursing staff gently asked him to take some down, and he moved them to the windowsill instead. One afternoon in November, when the light in the room was thin and low and golden, Miss Dorothy called both boys to her bedside. Her voice was quieter than it used to be, but it was still entirely hers, still the voice that had narrated every one of their best summers. With hands that shook slightly, the hands that had taught them things and fed them things and held them when they cried and applauded at every school play and held Samuel's hands for 41 years, she reached beneath the collar of her hospital gown and unclasped both chains. She held them for a moment, just looked at them in her open palm. 41 years of mornings. 41 years of going out into the world with these 2 small pieces of gold warm against her skin. Samuel's love, tangible, wearable, carried everywhere he wasn't. She placed the cross around Darius's neck. She placed the heart around Jordan's. "These were your grandfather's gifts to me," she said. Her eyes were clear and steady, clearer than they had been in weeks. 41 years I wore them. Every single day. And I never once took them off because every time I thought about it, I thought, Why would I take off something this beautiful? She reached up and touched each chain one final time. The cross at Darius's throat, the heart at Jordan's. These are 41 years of his love.
You carry that now.
And don't you ever take them off. You hear me? Don't you ever let anybody make you take them off. 3 weeks later, Miss Dorothy was gone. The boys wore the chains to her funeral. They wore them to school the week after. Darius wore his to soccer practice and to sleep and to every single place he went from that day forward, because his grandmother had asked him not to take it off, and he had made a promise, and he was the kind of boy who kept his promises. Diana watched them wear those chains, and she felt two things at once. The way grief makes you feel two contradictory things simultaneously. Pride so large it almost hurt, and a fear she could not quite name and could not quite put down. She was a black woman in America who had been a black girl in America, and she understood, in a way she hoped her boys would not have to understand for a long time, that the world had opinions about what black children were allowed to own, and allowed to carry, and allowed to keep. So she did what Miss Dorothy had always told her to do. She prepared. She pulled out the folder she kept for important documents, ticket confirmations, emergency contacts, and the letter from the airline confirming the compassionate bereavement booking, and she packed it in Darius's backpack. She zipped it into the interior pocket. She didn't tell him what it was. She just told him to keep his backpack safe. And on the morning of the flight, she drove them to Hartsfield-Jackson in the dark before sunrise. Gate C-22. The terminal was bright, and the coffee smell was thick, and Darius had the backpack on both shoulders, and Jordan was holding a small stuffed dog that had been Miss Dorothy's and that he had claimed, quietly and without asking, from the shelf in her Savannah house. Diana knelt in front of both of them one last time. She straightened their collars. She touched each chain the way Miss Dorothy used to, carefully, briefly, the tips of her fingers acknowledging every single thing those two small pieces of gold represented. She tucked the folder deeper into Darius's bag and zipped it again. Then she leaned close to Darius and she whispered something in his ear. "We are not going to tell you what she said yet. You are going to have to stay with this story until the very end to hear it. But I promise you, when we get there, it is going to be worth every minute of the wait." Diana watched her boys walk down the jet bridge until they disappeared from view. She stood at the window until the plane pushed back from the gate. Then she sat down in one of the terminal chairs, pressed her hands together in her lap, and waited. And somewhere in row 13 of that aircraft, a man named Gerald Watkins was settling into his aisle seat. He was 52 years old, a civil rights attorney from Chicago, traveling home from a 2-day conference in Atlanta. He was wearing a tailored gray suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase and, this is important, remember this, a pair of thin silver-framed glasses that looked, to most people, like perfectly ordinary glasses. They were not ordinary glasses, but we will come back to that. The narrator said, it was the kind of morning where nothing could go wrong. Both boys had their grandmother's gold resting against their chests. The window seat was theirs. The clouds were building soft and white as the plane climbed into the Georgia sky. Jordan pressed his forehead to the glass and watched Atlanta disappear beneath them. Nothing could go wrong, right? Before we go any further, if you are not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like this one take real time and real research and real care to put together, and every single subscriber tells the algorithm to keep pushing these stories to the people who need to hear them. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and let's keep going. Now, here's my question for you at the end of Act 1, and I want you to answer this honestly in the comments. When you think about something your grandmother or grandfather gave you, something physical, something you still have or wish you still had, what is it, and what does it mean to you? Tell me in the comments. I want to read every single one. The flight leveled off at 32,000 feet somewhere over Tennessee, and for the first 40 minutes everything was exactly as it should have been. Jordan had fallen asleep against Darius's shoulder, the stuffed dog tucked under his arm, his mouth slightly open, his small face completely relaxed. Darius was watching the clouds, not analyzing them the way Miss Dorothy had taught him, not working through formations or reading the afternoon weather, just watching them, the way you watch something beautiful when you have nowhere to be except exactly where you are. His hand rested loosely in his lap, and the cross at his collar caught the flat cabin light and threw it back soft and gold, and the whole row had the particular stillness of a place where two children are at peace. Sandra Merritt pushed the drink cart down the aisle on the first pass. She was in her late 40s, efficient, correct in every outward measure of her job. She wore her uniform the way some people wear armor, precisely, without looseness, every button in its place, every motion practiced down to the economy of movement. She had been a flight attendant for over 2 decades, and in 2 decades she had developed, as some people do, a set of categories for passengers that she had confused with experience. She thought her categories were the result of careful observation accumulated over years. They were not. They were the result of something else entirely. Something older. Something that had never once been examined. On the first pass, her eyes dropped to the boys' necks. Not a glance. A count. The kind of looking that is actually a judgment rendered before a single piece of evidence has been gathered. She kept moving. In 15B, Patricia Coleman noticed. She was 63 years old, retired from 31 years of teaching 8th grade at a public school in Charlotte, North Carolina, and she had spent those 31 years developing the particular skill of reading the precise moment when a child was about to be made to feel small by someone with more institutional authority than sense. She removed one earbud. In 13A, Gerald Watkins looked up from his laptop. He had registered the same thing Patricia had registered, from a different angle and through a different set of professional lenses, but arriving at the same understanding. He noticed it the way a doctor notices a symptom, not with alarm yet, not with urgency yet, but with the attentiveness of someone whose entire career has been spent learning to see what other people choose not to see until it is too late. In 16C, Jada Monroe, 24 years old, travel content creator, casual documentarian of her own daily life, was holding her phone sideways and recording a quiet travel diary she had been keeping since the gate. She had been recording every flight for 2 years, partly for content, and partly because she simply liked having a record of where she had been, and what the light looked like, and how the world felt on ordinary days. Her camera was angled toward the window seat across the aisle, where the morning light was making soft shapes on the headrest fabric. She hadn't pointed it at anyone intentionally. She was just recording. Her camera had been running for 38 uninterrupted minutes. It did not stop. Sandra came back through on the second pass without the cart. She walked more slowly this time. Her eyes moved to row 14 and stayed a beat longer than any professional reason required, and then moved away. She continued toward the galley. Jordan stirred in his sleep and shifted against Darius's shoulder. Darius put a brief hand on his little brother's arm, studying him the way older siblings do without thinking, the automatic gesture of someone who has appointed themselves protector of something small and important. His hand, when it came back to rest in his lap, paused at his collar. Just for a moment. He touched the cross without realizing he was doing it. Some part of him had already registered that the atmosphere around row 14 had changed, even if the conscious, reasoning part of his mind had not yet caught up. Sandra came back a third time. No cart. No service purpose. She stopped at row 14. She stood there a moment before speaking. Hands clasped, chin slightly elevated, the expression of someone who has already reached their conclusion and is now simply delivering the verdict. "Excuse me," she said. "I need both of you to remove your necklaces and place them in your bags for the duration of the flight." Darius woke Jordan gently, with a hand on his arm. He looked up at Sandra with his face arranged exactly the way Diana had taught him to arrange it in the presence of authority. Calm, polite, no edge, nothing that could be used against him later. He was 11 years old, and he had already been taught how to arrange his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "Your necklaces. I need them removed and stored." "Why?" "It's a safety concern." Darius looked at her for a moment and then looked, slowly and deliberately, around the cabin. The woman in 12A was wearing large gold hoop earrings. The man across the aisle had a thick silver chain of his own visible above his collar and a heavy watch on his wrist. The woman in 11B had 3 rings on each hand and a layered bracelet set that clinked softly when she moved. Not one of them had been approached. Not one of them had been asked to store anything. "Ma'am," Darius said, very quietly, "nobody else has been asked to take their jewelry off." "I've made my assessment," Sandra said. As if those 4 words were a complete and sufficient answer to an entirely factual observation made by an 11-year-old boy. As if her assessment, unilateral, unexplained, unchallengeable, was a substitute for logic or fairness or the basic principle that a safety policy must apply uniformly or it is not a safety policy at all. Can you tell me specifically what the safety concern is? Darius asked. That's not information I'm required to share. Can you show me the policy that requires passengers to remove jewelry? I don't need to show you anything. I need you to comply. Jordan was fully awake now. He had heard all of it. He was sitting very still with that particular frozen quality children get when an adult they have never met is angry at them for reasons they cannot understand, when the implicit rules of a space have changed without anyone explaining the change, and all you know is that something is wrong and somehow, inexplicably, the wrong thing seems to be you. These were our grandmothers, Darius said. His voice was steady. She passed away 3 weeks ago. She gave these to us before she died. We're flying to our aunt's house because of her. For one fraction of a moment something moved behind Sandra's eyes, not softness, not empathy exactly, but the briefest flicker of recognition that there was a human story in front of her. And then it was gone. Her expression reset. Her chin came up. I understand, she said, the phrase she apparently used when she didn't understand and had no intention of trying. I still need you to comply. She walked away. She would be back. Patricia Coleman had fully removed both earbuds. She was watching row 14 with the expression of someone calculating whether the moment had arrived. Not quite yet, but close. Gerald Watkins had quietly closed his laptop. Jada's phone had not moved. Sandra returned 15 minutes later. This time she brought Brett with her, a younger male attendant mid-30s, wearing the slightly mortified expression of someone who has been instructed to back up a colleague he has private doubts about but lacks the professional nerve to contradict. 2 uniforms in the aisle now. The geometry of the situation had changed. 2 adults over 2 children, institutional authority pressing down from above on 2 small boys in window and middle seats. Sandra's voice had shifted with the company. Still controlled but louder. Pitched for the surrounding rows rather than for the boys. Performed for the cabin audience she was implicitly building. There have been concerns raised, she said, about these items. Concerns raised. As though there had been a committee. As though professionals had convened and examined evidence and produced findings. Concerns. Raised. By whom she did not say, because there was no whom. There was only Sandra's eyes moving to 2 chains on 2 necks and a conclusion forming in the half-second before any fact had been considered. Darius reached into his backpack. Not for the folder. That would come later, and when it came it would land differently because of everything that had happened before it. His mother had packed something else too, slipped into the front pocket along with the emergency contact card. A printed photograph. Both boys at Miss Dorothy's funeral 3 weeks ago, standing together in the front row in their good clothes, wearing the exact 2 chains, the casket soft-focused in the background. Their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of children who have understood for the first time that the people they love can permanently leave. He held the photograph up to Sandra. She gave them to us, he said. That's her funeral. We were wearing them right there. Sandra's eyes moved to the photograph. The movement was brief enough to constitute the legal minimum of acknowledgement, barely enough to register what the image was actually showing, and then she said, That doesn't verify ownership. That doesn't verify ownership. The man across the aisle set his magazine in his lap. Patricia Coleman's hands tightened against each other. And in that moment, the specific moment when a photograph of 2 small boys standing at their grandmother's casket was declared insufficient evidence of the legitimacy of their loss, Darius Carter experienced a flash of something that lasted less than 30 seconds, but felt much longer inside it. He was back in the hospital room. The gold light was there, the way it had been in November, thin and low, the kind of light that falls at the end of an afternoon when the season has already turned. And Miss Dorothy's hands were before him. The hands he knew better than almost any hands in the world. The hands that had made biscuits and braided hair, and held his face and applauded at his school plays and stayed clasped around Samuel's hands for 41 years. Those hands were shaking slightly as they held both chains out between them. The cross. The heart. Her voice quieter than it had always been but still entirely hers. These are 41 years of his love. You carry that now. And don't you ever take them off. Don't you ever let anybody make you take them off. Sandra Merritt's voice snapped him back. Are you going to comply or not? Darius folded the photograph carefully and returned it to the backpack.
His face had not changed.
His hands were visible. His voice, when he answered, had not changed either. No, he said. I'm not going to take them off. Brett shifted his weight in the aisle. Sandra's jaw tightened by a fraction. I want you to understand, Sandra said, and the coldness in her voice now was deliberate, engineered specifically for the impact it would have on an 11-year-old traveling without his parents, that if you continue to refuse, I will file a formal incident report. That report will flag both of your travel records. It will be sent to your parents. It will follow you. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Darius understood exactly. She was telling him that the act of wearing his grandmother's jewelry, of honoring the last request of a woman who had loved him more than he had words for, could become a permanent mark on his record. A flag that followed him into every future flight, every future interaction with every future authority figure who had the power to decide what kind of passenger, what kind of person he was going to be allowed to be. His hands were visible. His voice was barely above a murmur. Please don't do that. We didn't do anything. And in the space between what he said and what Sandra did next, he heard his mother's voice. Not from a speech or a dramatic moment, from a Tuesday 2 months ago, Diana at the kitchen stove, stirring something without looking at him, saying something important in the way she said important things, quietly into the middle distance, trusting him to understand the weight of it.
Darius.
When someone with authority decides to misuse it against you, and it will happen, baby, it will happen, you stay calm. You keep everything. Every ticket, every receipt, every record. And you never, ever give them the version of you that they want. He had not known on that Tuesday what she meant. He reached into his backpack with one hand, not to open the folder, not yet, just to feel it there. His fingers found the edge of the folder Diana had packed without explaining. It was there, solid, prepared. His hand came back to his lap. He straightened in his seat. He did not give Sandra Merritt the version of himself she wanted. Sandra turned slightly toward the surrounding rows, not addressing anyone specifically, just making sure the cabin understood that she had behaved professionally, that whatever followed was the boys' choice, that she had given them every opportunity to comply. It was a performance and not a convincing one, but it was the performance she had committed to, and she was going to see it through. I will be returning shortly, she said. I expect compliance. She walked away with Brett behind her. The cabin was quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. Not the quiet of indifference. Not the quiet of passengers looking away and reaching for their earbuds. This was the quiet of people who had witnessed something and were in the process, individually and collectively, of deciding what to do with what they had seen. Patricia Coleman looked across the aisle at Darius. She said, in a voice pitched for only the rows immediately around them, "You are doing beautifully. Both of you." Jordan had not spoken in 20 minutes. He was sitting perfectly still with a stuffed dog held in both hands on his lap, his face turned toward the seat back in front of him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were dry. He had cried once, quietly, when Sandra said formal incident report, and now he had gone somewhere inside himself that was defended and quiet, somewhere he knew how to find when the outside world became too much. Gerald Watkins had risen from his seat. He was standing in the aisle, and he was looking toward the galley with an expression that was not angry and was not impatient. It was the expression of a man who has been watching for the right moment for a long time and has decided, with complete calm, that the moment has arrived. And Jada Monroe had stopped thinking about the light on the window. Sandra returned. With her this time was Lynn Park, the senior flight attendant, tall and measured, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who has been handed a situation that requires handling and intends to handle it correctly. Sandra was talking as they walked, her version of events already being constructed and offered, already in motion before Lynn had a chance to form her own picture from scratch. Lynn listened. Her face did not move. When they reached row 14, Sandra positioned herself slightly behind Lynn. Barely perceptible, but the shift was there. Something in Lynn Park's posture had communicated something to Sandra that made her want to be behind someone else. The woman who had stood alone at that row for the past 30 minutes, with all the certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything, was now, suddenly, very interested in standing behind the person with more seniority. Lynn looked at Darius. She looked at Jordan. She looked at the chains, one cross, one small heart, both worn smooth and clearly old, clearly loved, clearly not something lifted from a display case. And then she looked at Sandra. We will get to what happened next in Act 3. But first, I need you to stop right here and answer this question in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. Have you ever been in a situation where you showed someone proof, actual, documented, undeniable proof, and they still refused to believe you? What happened, and how did it make you feel? Tell me your story below. You might be surprised how many people have been through something similar. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it right now. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell. Do not let this story get buried in your feed. Lynn Park knelt beside row 14. Not stood. Not loomed.
Knelt.
She brought herself to eye level with both boys in a single, deliberate motion that communicated, before she had spoken a single word, everything about what kind of interaction this was going to be. Not a confrontation. Not an investigation. A conversation between one adult who intended to be worthy of being trusted and two children who had spent the last 45 minutes having every reason not to trust any adult in a uniform. She introduced herself. She asked Darius if he was okay. He said yes. She asked Jordan if he was okay. Jordan looked at her for a long moment, the assessing look of a child deciding whether an adult is safe, and then he gave a small, careful nod. Lynn nodded back, and there was in that exchange the particular quiet understanding that passes between people when one of them has just decided, cautiously, to extend a fraction of trust to the other. I want to hear what happened, Lynn said. Everything in your own words, from the beginning. Take as much time as you need. Darius told her. He told it in sequence, without exaggeration, without the emotional heightening that would have been entirely forgivable given everything he had just been through. He described the first approach, the safety claim, the lack of any cited policy. He described the photo from the funeral and the 4 words that answered it. That doesn't verify ownership. He described the threat of the incident report. He described the specific word she had used, aggressive, applied to him after 45 minutes during which he had not raised his voice once, had not made a single threatening gesture, had not done anything that any reasonable observer would have described as anything other than a child sitting in a seat and declining to remove something his grandmother gave him before she died. He spoke for 3.5 minutes, without being interrupted. Lynn listened to every word with the full, unhurried attention of someone who understands that the quality of listening is what determines whether a person will ever tell you the truth again. She did not look towards Sandra for confirmation. She did not look at her watch. She did not arrange her face into the professional neutrality of someone who has already decided. She simply listened to an 11-year-old boy and treated everything he said as worth hearing. When Darius finished, she asked, "Do you have any documentation related to the booking? Anything at all?" Darius reached into his backpack. Into the interior pocket, the one Diana had zipped and re-zipped on the morning of the flight, pressing the folder deeper as if depth could make it more powerful, more sure to be there when it was needed. He removed it, still folded, still closed, and held it out to Lynn. She took it. She opened it.
She read.
And something changed in her posture. Not dramatically, not visibly to the casual observer, just a small, precise shift, the kind of shift that happens when a professional encounters information that renders one version of events completely indefensible and they understand, in the moment of reading, that everything they need to know about what happened here is already documented and already clear. She looked up from the folder. Gerald Watkins had risen. He was standing in the aisle with the unhurried authority of a man who has spent his career identifying the moments that require him to stand and has become extraordinarily precise about which those moments are. "My name is Gerald Watkins," he said. He gave his name its full weight, not the performed weight of someone who wants to impress, just the simple, solid weight of a name attached to a person who intends to be taken seriously and has earned the right to expect it. "I am a civil rights attorney, licensed in the state of Illinois and admitted to practice before the federal courts. I have been seated in row 13 for the entire duration of this incident. I observed every exchange from the first approach. I would like to speak." Lynn looked at him. Please. What Gerald Watkins delivered then was not a speech. It was a deposition. Precise, chronological, and merciless in the particular way that precision and chronology are merciless when applied to something that cannot withstand scrutiny. He described every exchange in order. He noted approximate times. He identified the specific language, concerns raised, which implies institutional process when there was no process, aggressive, applied to a child who had been calm throughout, assessment, used as though it were a conclusion derived from evidence, when no evidence had been examined. He named the other passengers he had observed wearing jewelry, the woman in 12A, the man across the aisle, others he had quietly catalogued from the moment he understood where this was going, and he noted that not one of them had been approached. He did not raise his voice at any point. He did not need to. He had something more powerful than volume. He had the sequence of facts laid out in order, and the sequence made its own argument without any help from emotion. And then he reached up and removed his glasses. He held them out in front of him for a moment. Silver-framed, thin, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. These, he said, are equipped with a front-facing recording device. Legal in all 50 states, including Georgia and Illinois. Standard issue at my firm since 2021, following an incident involving my brother. They have been recording continuously since I boarded this aircraft. Every word spoken within range. Every word this crew member directed at these children. Every word she directed at me when she said, and he paused here, allowing the pause to do exactly what pauses do when they precede something that doesn't need emphasis because it carries its own. You think wearing those little glasses makes you smart. Sandra made a sound. It was a small sound, not a word, not a protest, not an objection. Just an involuntary, unguarded response to the sudden and complete understanding that the ground beneath her had silently fallen away while she was standing on it, and she was only finding out about it now, at the moment it mattered most. The moment it was too late. Because that line, the glasses line, the contemptuous little aside she had directed at Gerald Watkins while she was in the middle of threatening 2 children, that line was the line that made everything else impossible to characterize as a misunderstanding. A professional making an honest error in judgment does not pause mid-confrontation to mock a passenger for wearing glasses. A person applying a policy inconsistently, but without prejudice, does not sneer at a witness. That line proved something. It proved that Sandra Merritt had looked at Gerald Watkins, at his dark skin and his silver frames and his open laptop in row 13, and made an assessment about him too. The same kind of assessment she had made about 2 boys in row 14. The exact same kind. And instead of adjusting when she felt herself being watched, instead of checking herself in the presence of someone who was clearly paying attention, she had doubled down. She had performed her authority not to spite the witness, but directly at the witness. Because she had looked at Gerald Watkins and decided he wasn't a threat. She had been wrong about that the way she had been wrong about everything else since the moment she first pushed the drink cart past row 14. Gerald handed the glasses to Lynn, who examined them briefly and returned them. Patricia Coleman, in 15B, raised her hand the way she had raised students' hands for them when they were too shy to raise their own. I witnessed this incident in its entirety, she said. Both earbuds out from the first exchange. I can corroborate everything this gentleman has described. Word by word. A man in 17A, same. I heard all of it. A woman in 12C. I saw the whole thing. 3 more voices. Not a mob. Not a performance. Just a cabin full of regular people on a Tuesday morning in November who had seen something and knew what they had seen and were prepared, one by one, to say so. Lynn Park turned to Sandra. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform the authority she held. She simply exercised it, which is a completely different thing and far more powerful. You had access to the passenger manifest before this flight departed, Lynn said. You had access to the booking classification. These passengers are listed on a compassionate bereavement fare. That classification carries a specific crew duty of care. It means from the moment these boys boarded, crew was responsible for their comfort and well-being. The documentation is in this folder, which their mother filed with the airline before departure. You had access to it. You didn't look. Sandra opened her mouth. Lynn continued without pause. Their jewelry is a cross and a small heart. Both are visibly personal, visibly old, visibly not a safety concern under any FAA standard or any airline policy currently in existence. You ask these children to remove items while leaving every other passenger on this aircraft wearing jewelry entirely unaddressed. When asked to explain the discrepancy, you said you had made your assessment. When a child showed you a photograph of himself at his grandmother's funeral wearing this jewelry, you said it didn't verify ownership. Lynn held the folder up briefly. He is 11 years old. He is traveling on a bereavement ticket. This is documented. This was always documented. She folded the folder closed. You are relieved from service for the remainder of this flight. A formal report will be filed on landing. Please proceed to the galley. Brett had already taken a step back. He was removing himself from the radius of what was happening with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of someone who has decided that the correct move is to not be associated with any part of this, not now, and not in the report that was going to be filed, and not in whatever followed the report. He had backed a colleague who did not deserve to be backed, and he was going to have to carry that. But he was not going to carry it visibly, not in this aisle, not in front of these witnesses. Sandra stood completely still, and then her face changed. The professional mask, the armor of absolute certainty she had been wearing since the first moment she stood at row 14 and looked down at two children and decided they were a problem, came off. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It fell the way things fall when they have been held up by conviction and the conviction is suddenly gone, quietly, completely, leaving behind only the face underneath. What was underneath was not rage or defiance or even indignation. It was something much simpler and much more final, the naked, unguarded recognition that she had made an error of the most irreversible kind. Not a factual error, not a policy error, the kind that lives in the character, not in the procedure. The kind you cannot blame on a misunderstanding because every witness in a 30-row radius can describe, in sequence, exactly what you did and why it cannot be defended. She walked to the back of the plane. She did not look at the boys. Patricia Coleman, in 15B, began to applaud. Slowly. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. The sound was deliberate and unhurried, not triumphant, not mocking, just present. Just, we saw this, all of us, and this is the sound we choose to make to market. 3 other passengers joined. Then a few more. Not a roar. Not a standing ovation. The quiet, measured sound of a cabin that had witnessed something and decided, collectively, that it was worth acknowledging. Lynn Park knelt again beside row 14. She looked at Jordan first because Jordan was the one who had come closest to the edge, and she could see the residue of it in the tightness around his eyes and the careful way he was still holding the stuffed dog in both hands, as if it were a smaller thing that needed protecting. I am so sorry, she said. What happened here should not have happened. You did absolutely nothing wrong. Not one single thing. Your jewelry is yours. It belongs on your necks. It belongs there for every flight you ever take on any airline for the rest of your lives. And if anyone ever tells you otherwise, you ask to speak to a supervisor immediately and you do not remove anything. Jordan looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. Very small. But he said it. Lynn straightened and looked at Darius. Your mother prepared very well, she said. There was recognition in it, not just of Diana's paperwork, but of everything the paperwork represented. The midnight preparation, the care compressed into documentation, love, expressed as a folder with an interior pocket and a zipper checked twice. Gerald Watkins leaned forward and placed his business card on Darius's tray table. Have your mother call me, he said. There's no charge. I just want to make sure your family has what they need. Darius picked up the card with both hands. Patricia Coleman crossed the aisle without asking and sat down in the empty seat beside Jordan. She didn't make a production of it. She just sat, the way teachers sit when a student needs someone nearby, present, unhurried, not requiring anything. She gave Jordan a tissue. She talked to him quietly about Chicago, about deep dish pizza, about whether he had ever seen Lake Michigan in winter, and how it looked nothing like the ocean but was worth seeing anyway. Jordan had never seen it. Patricia told him it was going to surprise him. Jada Monroe looked up from her phone and caught Darius's eye. She held the phone up slightly, just enough. The question was clear without words.
Darius thought about it.
He asked, "Will it help?" Jada looked at the footage. She thought about what she had watched happen in that aisle for 45 minutes. She looked back at him. "I think it'll help a lot of people," she said. Darius thought for one more moment. Then, okay. The rest of the flight was quiet. Not the tense quiet of before. Something different. The quiet of resolution. Of a pressure having released, a wrong having been named and addressed and witnessed by enough people that it could not be undone.
Calmer.
But not the same calm as before, and it never would be. The peace was back, but it was a different peace now, the kind that has been earned rather than assumed, that has looked at its own fragility and decided to hold anyway. Jordan fell back asleep against Darius's shoulder before they even began the descent into O'Hare. The stuffed dog was still in his arms. The gold heart chain was still at his collar. The cross was still at Darius's. Both of them warm and soft and gold in the winter light from the window. The narrator said, "They were not unscathed, but they were unbroken." I need you to answer this question before we go to Act 4 because I have been thinking about it since I first heard this story, and I want to know what you think. When Gerald Watkins stood up from that seat, when he rose and gave his name and started speaking, do you think Sandra Merritt understood immediately that it was over? Or do you think she still believed, even then, that she could talk her way out of it? And here is the follow-up. What do you think it took for her to finally see what she had done? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't. This story is not over. The next act is where everything goes public, and it is bigger than Sandra ever imagined. Jada Monroe was still at the gate at O'Hare when she posted the video. She had walked off the jet bridge, found a seat in a quiet corner of the terminal near the windows looking out over the tarmac, and sat there for 20 minutes with her phone in both hands and the footage open in front of her, watching it again. Not to verify what she had seen. She had been there. She had watched every second of it unfold in real time. She knew exactly what the footage contained. She was watching it because she was trying to make sure, before she put it into the world, that the world would be able to understand what it was seeing without any ambiguity. Without any version that Sandra Merritt or anyone else could substitute for the version that had actually happened. Because footage of this kind only does what it is supposed to do, only serves the people it needs to serve. When the framing is honest, the context is clear, and the viewer has no comfortable alternative story to retreat into. Jada was 24 years old, and she had been creating content since she was 19, and she understood something about how people receive information that most people her age hadn't yet learned to articulate. The media matters less than the clarity. The footage could be raw, unedited, imperfect, and it was all of those things, as long as what happened in it was impossible to look away from and impossible to misread. She watched the cross. She watched the heart. She watched the funeral photograph held up and the 4 words that answered it. She watched Darius's face throughout, composed, steady, maddening in its composure because it cost so much to maintain, and you could see, if you watched carefully, exactly what it cost. She watched Jordan's hands go up to the chain at his collar. She watched Darius catch them. She wrote the caption the way she would have told a friend what happened over the phone. No sensationalism. No editorial. Plain language in plain sentences. 2 little boys on this flight, she wrote. Their grandmother passed away 3 weeks ago. She gave them her jewelry before she died. A flight attendant spent 25 minutes demanding they take it off. This is what happened. She attached Gerald Watkins's contact information at his specific request. She posted it. Then she put the phone face down on the seat beside her, closed her eyes, and did not look at it for 10 minutes. When she picked it back up, there were already over 1,000 views. By the time she reached baggage claim, 6,000. By the time she was in the cab, 22,000. By midnight, when she was sitting on the couch in her apartment eating takeout and watching the counter with an expression that was something between stunned and unsurprised, because she had known, somewhere in the part of her that understood how the internet worked, that this particular footage was the kind that does not stay small. The counter was approaching 200,000. The comments were something to see. There was outrage, enormous and immediate, and entirely justified. There were people tagging the airline, tagging media organizations, tagging every travel-focused account with enough followers to amplify what was happening. There was the particular social media forensics that kicks in when the internet collectively decides that something needs to be fully understood, the timeline reconstruction, the policy research, the people who had been on that flight posting their own accounts of what they had witnessed, corroborating Jada's footage from 4 different seat perspectives. But the thing that made it spread, the thing that kept it spreading past the first wave of outrage, past the second wave of shares, past the point where most viral videos plateau and flatten, was the specificity. You could see the cross. You could see the heart. You could see Darius holding up a photograph of himself at his grandmother's funeral, and you could see Sandra not look at it, her eyes sliding away from an image of 2 children in their good clothes standing at a casket with the quiet and curiosity of someone who has decided in advance that nothing this child shows her is going to change what she has already decided. You could hear the word aggressive applied to a boy who had not raised his voice once. You could hear the words, "I've made my assessment," delivered, as though they ended an argument that had barely been allowed to begin. And you could see, this is what Jada's footage did that no written account could fully replicate. You could see Darius Carter, for the entire duration of the footage, refusing to become the person Sandra Merritt was trying to make him. Through every exchange, through every escalation, through every dismissal, through the threat and the second uniform and the performative address to the cabin, Darius Carter sat straight, spoke clearly, kept his hands where they could be seen, and did not once give Sandra Merritt the thing she was angling for. He was 11 years old. He was more composed than most adults are when they are not being threatened. The video showed you what that composure looked like. It also showed you, if you watched carefully enough, what it cost him to hold it. And it was impossible to watch that cost being paid, in the slight tightening around his eyes, in the moments when his hand moved to his collar, in the micro-expression that crossed his face when Sandra said those 4 words about the photograph, without understanding exactly what the story was about underneath all its surface details. Sandra Merritt was identified within 18 hours. The internet, when it decides something deserves to be known, is considerably faster than any institutional process. A full aircraft of witnesses. Clear crew badge identification in the footage. Professional history surfaced. The airline social team, which had been monitoring the growing hashtag since the first hour, convened an emergency response. At noon the following day, the airline released a formal statement. The behavior depicted in the footage, the statement read, is not consistent with our values, our policies, or the duty of care we hold for all passengers, including our most vulnerable travelers. The crew member has been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. We have contacted the family directly to offer our sincerest apology. The crew member in question. They did not use her name. The internet had been using her name for 16 of the 18 hours since the footage appeared. By the time the airline posted its statement, Sandra Merritt was no longer simply a crew member who had made a poor judgment call on a Tuesday in November. She was a proper noun. A cautionary reference. A name that appeared in comment sections and news aggregators and editorial pieces about implicit bias in customer-facing industries. Her professional future at that airline was not something anyone was willing to speculate about optimistically. Gerald Watkins, from his office in Chicago, provided his own footage, longer than Jada's, different angles, capturing audio from rows that Jada's phone hadn't reached, to the airline's legal team and to 3 national media organizations who reached out to him directly within 48 hours. His assistant, when fielding the inquiries, described the footage as comprehensive, which was accurate. Diana Carter, in Atlanta, watched the video for the first time at 6 in the morning on Wednesday. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her scrubs from the night shift she had worked specifically to afford the boys' plane tickets. She watched Darius hold up the funeral photograph. She watched Sandra not look at it. She watched Jordan's hands go up. She watched Darius stop him. She put the phone down. She sat with both hands flat on the table for a long time. The apartment was quiet around her. The light was just beginning to come in from the east-facing window. Then she picked up the phone and watched it again. Then she called Darius. For the boys themselves, at Aunt Renee's house in Chicago, eating breakfast and still wearing their chains because they had not taken them off and were not going to, the video going viral felt genuinely strange. Not bad, but strange in the specific way that it is strange to suddenly be the center of something enormous when all you wanted was to get somewhere safely. They had not boarded that plane hoping to represent anything. They had not worn those chains to make a statement. They were two children who had buried their grandmother and wanted to spend a week with their aunt and see the Chicago skyline from a window they had never seen and eat pizza that their mother hadn't made. They had simply existed, with their grandmother's gold against their chests, and that existence had been declared a problem by someone who had never thought to ask who they were. And here is where we have to say the larger thing. The thing that this story is about underneath the folder and the smart glasses and the footage and the formal investigation. The thing that was sitting in row 14 on that flight, invisible and enormous and older than anyone on that aircraft. Black people in America have been subjected to the presumption that they do not own what they carry for as long as there has been a legal category called property and a social category called black. A black man driving a car that exceeds expectations is pulled over at higher rates than anyone else driving the same car. A black woman in a high-end store is followed in ways that white women in the same store are not. A black family in a neighborhood that someone has decided they don't belong and has the police called on them for the act of being home. The assumption runs underneath all of it, consistent and ancient. You don't belong here. You couldn't have earned that. Someone like you must have taken it. The jewelry was never the issue. It was never about the jewelry. Two small pieces of gold worn by two children who had just lost the most important person in their world were not a safety concern. Darius was holding Gerald Watkins's card while she talked. He had been carrying it since the plane, not stored in the backpack, not put in the folder, just in his pocket or on the table in front of him wherever he sat. Within reach. Present. "Mom," he said. At the gate.
When you whispered to me.
Before we went through. What did you say?
A pause on the line.
The particular pause of someone who has been carrying words that were given to them by someone they have lost and is now preparing to pass them forward to the next person who needs them. "Your grandmother told me," Diana said. Her voice was quieter now. Not smaller, just lower, the way voices get when they're saying something they received from somewhere sacred and want to handle carefully.
Before she passed.
She said, "Tell those boys the world is going to test them. Not because of anything wrong they've done, just because of who they are, because of what they look like and where they come from and what people will decide about them before they've had the chance to say a single word." She said, "When that test comes, and it will come, it always comes, they better already know who they are. Because if they know it, truly know it, nobody can take it."
She paused.
"That's what I whispered. At the gate. I told you. She says you're ready." Darius put the phone down very carefully on the table in front of him, the way you set down something that is full. He sat at Renee's kitchen table in Chicago with Jordan asleep on the couch behind him and Gerald's card on the table and the cross at his collar, and he was 11 years old, and he had been through something that no 11-year-old should ever have to go through. He was not pretending it was fine. He was not performing strength. He was not standing in the posture of someone who has decided that what happened to them doesn't count. What happened counted. It would always have happened. No outcome erases the 45 minutes it took to get to the outcome. But he was steady. In the way his mother was steady. In the way Miss Dorothy had made his mother steady. In the way that what we inherit from the people who love us most doesn't arrive as speeches or lessons or even as memories. It arrives as posture. As the way we hold our hands when someone is trying to frighten us. As the two words we say when our little brother's hands are going up to something he was told to keep.
No, don't. Now.
Let us say the final thing about Sandra Merritt. Not with anger. Anger is not what this story ends on, but with clarity, because clarity is what this story has always been. Sandra Merritt walked down that aisle and she saw two little boys with gold chains, and she made an assessment. She decided, in the fraction of a second that assessments like hers are always made, that Darius and Jordan Carter were a problem requiring her intervention. She did not see Miss Dorothy's 41 years. She did not see Samuel's love worn smooth by 4 decades of mornings. She did not see Diana's night shifts, the midnight table, the folder packed with the kind of care that costs something. She did not see the November hospital room, the thin gold light, and the shaking hands, and a woman making sure that the people she loved would carry something of her into the world that she was leaving. She did not see two brothers who sat beside a dying woman and held her hands and read to her and drew her portraits and taped them to a wall. She did not see the boy who caught his little brother's hands on an airplane at 30,000 feet when his little brother was about to give away something he had been asked to keep. She saw two black children with jewelry. She made her assessment, and that assessment cost her everything. It did not take a single thing from Darius and Jordan Carter, because you cannot take from someone what they already know they are. And those boys had been told, by a woman who understood that this knowledge was the most important inheritance she could pass on, more important than the chains themselves, more important than 41 years of gold. They had been told exactly who they were. And they knew it. They had known it all the way through. You carry 41 years of love around your neck. Someone tells you to take it off.
And you say no.
Not loudly. Not with your hands anywhere, but visible. Not with anything that gives anyone an excuse to use against you. Just no. I know what this is. I know where it came from. I know who put it there, and what she said when she put it there. And I am not taking it off. That is the victory. Not the administrative leave. Not the statement from the airline. Not the 200,000 views. Not even Gerald Watkins and his silver-framed glasses and his perfectly documented evidence. Those things matter. Accountability matters. Consequences matter. A world where Sandra Merritt faces no professional outcome for what she did on that flight is a worse world than one where she does. We should not pretend otherwise. But the victory, the real one, the one that Miss Dorothy was building toward across 41 years of wearing those chains, across every summer in that Savannah house, across every lesson about reading clouds and making biscuits and never throwing away something useful, the victory happened before any camera captured it, and before any attorney stood up, and before any senior flight attendant knelt down and apologized. The victory happened in row 14 when an 11-year-old boy looked at his little brother's hands going up to a gold chain and said, in the quietest voice on the quietest flight, the two most important words in this entire story.
No, don't.
Dignity is not something that can be demanded off of you. It does not unclasp. It does not loosen when you apply pressure. It lives in the posture, in the steadiness, in the hands that catch the other hands, and it passes forward through time the way love passes, the way those chains passed, from Miss Dorothy's neck to Darius's neck and Jordan's neck and forward, forward, forward into every room those boys will ever walk into for the rest of their lives. They landed in Chicago with their grandmother's gold still on. They always will. And somewhere, in the particular somewhere that 9-year-old Jordan had asked about when he pressed his forehead to the window and watched Atlanta fall away beneath him, Miss Dorothy could see them. She had been watching the whole time. Now, here is my final question, and I want you to take a real moment before you answer it. If you could say one thing to Darius and Jordan, one sentence, knowing everything you now know about who they are, and what they carried, and what they went through, and who gave them those chains, what would you say to them? Put it in the comments. Don't overthink it. Just say the thing you would want them to hear. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone you have lost or something you have been told you couldn't keep, if it made you want to call your grandmother or hold something precious a little tighter, please share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who wouldn't find it on their own. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment. Tell the algorithm that this kind of story deserves to travel. Because stories like this one do not go viral because they are unusual. They go viral because they are true. Because every person who watches them recognizes something. In Darius's composure, in Jordan's tears, in Diana's folder, in Miss Dorothy's hands, in Gerald Watkins rising from a seat, in Patricia Coleman sitting down next to a child who needed someone close. You recognize it because you have felt it, because you have been tested, because you have had something precious and been told to put it down, and because somewhere inside you is the same answer those two little boys gave.
No, don't.
Be Gerald. Be Patricia. Be Jada. Or just be the boy in row 14 who caught his brother's hands. Either way, know who you are. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.